April 1909. Wilbur Wright is in Italy conducting demonstration flights near Rome. On April 24th, he takes off for a special flight. For the first time ever, an airplane carries a movie camera aloft. This is the moment of birth of aerial photography. The Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum is the most visited museum in the world. Its collection contains some of the most important aircraft and spacecraft in history. Craft that were designed, built, and flown by men and women who have expanded the frontiers of flight. This is the Wright military flyer of 1909. It is the airplane the Wright brothers prepared to undergo a series of test flights for the military that year, in response to a Signal Corps specification calling for a heavier-than-air flying machine. It must have a speed of at least 40 miles an hour in still air and carry enough fuel to cover 125 miles. If successful, it will be purchased by the Signal Corps for $25,000 with a bonus for any extra speed achieved. The Wrights made an attempt in a similar airplane the year before, but it crashed and killed the Signal Corps observer. This is the story of some of the Wright brothers' commercial airplanes and the flights that took place in them. It's also the story of the achievements of some of the people who are now becoming their competitors on both sides of the Atlantic. On the River Seine near Paris in the summer of 1905, Gabriel Voisin experimented with a glider of his own design towed behind a speedboat. He also tested a machine modified for the French aviation pioneer Louis Blériot. It was a time of great activity in French aviation. Voisin and his colleagues knew of the work of the Wright brothers, and many of the Wright brothers' ideas were incorporated in their designs. In 1906, Alberto Santos Dumont flew more than 700 feet in a biplane of his own design called 14B. No French effort at this time matched the Wright brothers' flights of 1905, but claims were made that France had officially given birth to aviation. An argument developed in which prominent Americans defended the Wright brothers and suggested that some French aviators had borrowed their ideas. Santos Dumont vehemently denied knowledge of or belief in the Wright brothers' successes. In November 1907, Henri Farman flew his Voisin Farman over 4,000 feet, almost completing a circle. The controls had no system for banking, and turns were made by rudder alone. The Wright brothers were in France at the time, and Orville witnessed the flight. Neither he nor Wilbur considered the Voisin a practical machine. But the Wrights had not yet flown in France, and the French aviators were skeptical of their claims. Wilbur and Orville returned to America and found that the Army was interested in the Wright airplane. While Orville stayed in America to fly for the Army, in spring of 1908, Wilbur returned to France for a series of demonstration flights to close a deal selling manufacturing rights to a French syndicate. He set up a hangar at Les Unaudières near Le Mans. The flyer was damaged in transit from America and wasn't ready to fly until August. A skeptical France waited for the first public demonstration of the Wrights' claims. The Wright flyers of the time were launched from a rail much the same as the one they'd used at Kitty Hawk in 1903 for their first powered flight. But since 1905, they'd used another innovation to help them get into the air as efficiently as possible. They used a catapult launching system. A weight was pulled up in a tower, and when the engine was running, the weight was dropped, dragging the airplane along the track at takeoff speed. Wilbur's first flight on French soil on August the 8th showed that the controllability of the airplane was beyond anything the French had dreamed of. Soon Wilbur was making flights longer than 8 minutes. The crowds grew, and the press in England and France were wildly enthusiastic. There was no doubt now, the Wright brothers' claims were true. But still, Farman maintained that French machines were as good as the Wrights, and the Voisin brothers persisted in their claims that aviation was born in France. Wilbur moved to more open ground at Le Mans, and the crowds that attended his demonstrations grew so quickly that a ticketing system had to be introduced. Members of the French syndicate Wilbur was flying for wanted him to continue his demonstrations. The publicity would generate more interest from potential buyers and perhaps convince governments to consider the flying machine. Wilbur wrote to Orville telling him he would have to conduct the Army trials alone. He urged Orville to be cautious.
I have not yet learned to operate the handles without blunders, but I can easily make turns of 300 feet in diameter. Be awfully careful in beginning practice, and go slowly.
This is Fort Meyer in Northern Virginia, just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. It's the ceremonial home of the United States Army, a place of strong military tradition. In August 1908, Orville Wright arrived here to conduct a series of trial flights for the Army. A committee of 5 officers was appointed to oversee the tests. The Army had agreed to buy the Wright airplane for $25,000 on the condition that it could maintain an average speed of 40 miles an hour. For each additional mile an hour, there would be a bonus of $2,500 and a similar penalty for speeds less than the target. First, the airplane had to face a portability test, and from the balloon shed where it was being kept, it was loaded onto a wagon and pushed to the parade ground. The Wright military flyer passed the portability test without difficulty. Orville already knew 2 of the 5 officers who made up the trials committee. The most junior of the officers, Lieutenant Benjamin Fouloy, was particularly interested in flight and became a favorite of Orville's. Orville made his first flight in the series on September 3rd. He flew 1.5 circles of the field, taking 1 minute and 11 seconds. It was an impressive display, but initially the significance of Orville's flight was not realized. But as the days went by, Orville's flights attracted more and more attention. On September 9th, he set 3 world records, one of them an endurance flight of 57 minutes and 13 seconds. A few minutes after he landed, he took off again and stayed aloft for over an hour. Then he took Frank Lahm on a 6-minute flight that set a new record for endurance flights with a passenger. Orville still faced a major test. He had to make a cross-country demonstration flight of 10 miles from Fort Meyer to Alexandria and back again. His passenger was to be Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, a member of the Trials Committee. Selfridge was a member of the rival Aerial Experiment Association. Orville was uneasy about him.
I will be glad to have Selfridge out of the way. I don't trust him an inch. He plans to meet me at dinners, etc., where he can try and pump me. I understand that he does a good deal of knocking behind my back.
At 5 o'clock on the afternoon of September 17th, Orville took off with Selfridge and made 3 circuits of the parade ground. Orville heard a tapping sound, and then a violent shaking began. A damaged propeller had clipped a rudder line, sending the flyer crashing to the ground. When he was pulled from the wreckage, Orville was bleeding and unconscious. He had a broken thigh, broken ribs, and an injured back. He was in shock, but would survive. Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge was less fortunate than Orville. His skull was severely fractured. Selfridge was placed on a stretcher and taken to surgery at the Fort Meyer Post Hospital. A few minutes after coming out of the operating room, he died. Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge was buried in nearby Arlington Cemetery. He was the world's first fatality in the crash of a powered airplane. The Army accepted Orville's explanation of the accident. No penalty was imposed. The contract was extended so that the Wrights could return to Fort Meyer the following summer to complete the test flights. Wilbur heard the news of the crash in France and blamed himself for not being there. He took Mrs. Hart O'Berg, the wife of a close business associate, on a flight that made her one of the world's first female passengers of an airplane. In January 1909, Wilbur moved his demonstrations to Pau, near the Pyrenees in the south of France. King Alfonso of Spain, one of many members of European royalty who wintered at Biarritz, was particularly interested in the plane. Wilbur had been joined by his sister Catherine and Orville, now recovering from the accident. Wilbur's summer in France had been extremely successful. Now the Wrights and their airplane were subjected to close scrutiny by the public and the press. The trio from Dayton were treated as great celebrities and became objects of interest to European royalty and nobility. The aviation-mad French public couldn't get enough of the Wrights, but in late March, Wilbur moved on to Italy. At Centocelle near Rome, Wilbur spent 2 weeks making demonstration flights. On April 24th, he took a news cameraman aloft to film the world's first aerial motion picture. As well as flying demonstrations, Wilbur's Italian contract involved training 2 pilots. One of them was Lieutenant Mario Calderera. Neither Wilbur nor Orville liked him because he smoked heavily, but he was a good pilot. A year rolled around quickly. The Wrights returned to America to a hero's welcome and a series of what they considered time-wasting official engagements. When the celebrations were over, it was time to think of the Army, Fort Meyer, and the new military flyer. As well as portability, 40-mile-an-hour performance, and the ability to carry 2 people with a combined weight of 350 pounds, the Flyer of 1909 had to show that it could remain in the air for at least an hour. It had to be able to land without damage, so it could immediately take off for another flight. Landing should be possible without any specially prepared landing facility. And the Flyer should be able to land safely in the event of any damage to propellers or engine. The military flyer was generally similar in appearance to the flyers of 1904 and 1905, except that the engine, producing 25 horsepower, was more powerful, and the pilot sat upright instead of lying prone on the wing surface. By late June, the 1909 flyer was ready for testing. But with last year's accident in mind, the Wrights were being careful. They would not fly until they were confident all was ready. While they completed their preparations, a drama was developing across the Atlantic. In 1908, the London Daily Mail offered a prize of £500 to the first person to fly the English Channel. The Wright brothers had refused the challenge, leaving the field open for aviators like Frenchman Hubert Latham and his Antoinette monoplane. Latham based himself at the village of Sangatte, a few miles from Calais, and on July 19th, he and his Antoinette set out to make the Channel crossing to Dover in England. There was much local interest in the attempt. Latham was a colorful and popular aviator. Latham took off, and for a while the flight went well. Spectators tracked his progress as the Antoinette disappeared into the distance. He had only covered 6 miles when the engine stopped and he was forced down into the waters of the English Channel. There was little disappointment in Latham's camp. Léon Levavasseur, the builder of the Antoinette, boasted that his creation was capable of running, flying, and swimming, and the whole episode was a triumph. In the city of Calais, Latham was given a hero's welcome. His crash was not perceived as a failure, but in any case, it opened the way for Latham's competitors. Louis Blériot, who had been planning his own crossing, accelerated his efforts in spite of an injury to his foot, which had been burned when the exhaust pipe of his airplane blew out. 1909 had so far been a good year for Blériot and the airplanes he designed and built himself. He'd won a number of prizes, and his strained finances were in better shape than they'd been for a time. At sunrise on Sunday, July 25th, Blériot took off. There is no film of his flight, and this is a reconstruction. He stole a march on Latham, who had not been wakened as arranged. Blériot headed out into the English Channel at an altitude of 250 feet and a speed of about 45 miles an hour. Blériot was bound for Dover. As he flew out to sea, he remarked that he had no feeling of exultation and that the motion of the waves beneath him was not pleasant. Although Blériot said later that he didn't care where his airplane was going, he was actually heading for the English coast near Dover. A journalist had picked out a point near Dover Castle at North Foreland Meadow, which he suggested as a good landing spot. 36 minutes after takeoff, having covered the 23.5 miles from Calais to Dover, Blériot found his way to North Foreland Meadow. But he had problems with the wind, and he made a hard landing, severely damaging his airplane. One of the first questions he asked was whether Latham had made a successful flight. The answer was no. Latham was back in France, gracious in defeat, but disappointed at having been beaten across the Channel. The impact of Blériot's success was out of all proportion to the length of the flight, but its symbolic significance was great. The moat that had protected England throughout history had been bridged. Blériot was treated as a celebrity in England, and when he arrived back in France, he was hailed as a conquering hero. Blériot was made a Chevalier of the French Legion of Honor. From our historical perspective, these scenes in Paris in 1909 have a remarkable similarity to those that greeted Charles Lindbergh in New York 18 years later, having crossed another historically significant stretch of water. Blériot's Model 11, the airplane in which he'd flown the Channel, went on to become one of the most dominant European aircraft in the years before World War I. Back in 1908, when Lord Northcliffe announced the Daily Mail's prize for the first successful Channel crossing, he knew that Wilbur and Orville Wright were about the only people capable of making the flight. But the Wright brothers declined his invitation, being more interested in demonstration flights that would sell their machines. Anyway, they had flown much further than the distance across the English Channel. Little did they dream of the amazing public response they may have received if they had chosen to make the flight. At Fort Meyer, the Wright brothers competed with Blériot for headlines in the Washington papers. They weren't having much success. June and July had been unkind to them. In June, the whole of the U.S. Senate had come to Fort Meyer to see them fly. The Wrights considered the weather to be unsuitable, so they stayed on the ground. They were attacked viciously in the press, being accused of having snubbed congressmen. Their critics joined in, taking the opportunity offered by their careful preparations to accuse them of being frightened by the lightest breath of air. Even their friends became impatient with their delays and what seemed to be endless tinkering with their airplane. Orville, who was doing all the flying, had a couple of crashes, and one of them forced him to travel back to Dayton to make a new wing covering. Later in July, things improved. The day after Blériot's cross-channel triumph, President Taft was at Fort Meyer to see them make a successful takeoff without using the catapult. Thousands of spectators turned out every day to see the show. But the Wright brothers were learning that public acclaim is a fickle thing. On July 27th, Lieutenant Frank Lahm climbed aboard the military flyer to take a ride with Orville on a flight in which they'd attempt to prove the airplane's ability to carry a passenger. Frank Lahm had flown with Orville before. In the 1908 Fort Meyer trials, he'd spent 6 minutes in the air. But that was before the accident in which Lieutenant Selfridge was killed. As the weight for the catapult was hauled up in its tower, it's probable that Frank Lomb pondered the fate of his brother officer, whose body lay in a grave only a few hundred yards away in Arlington Cemetery. This is film of Orville Wright and Frank Lomb's flight on July 27, 1909. It gives a good idea of the way the airplane could be controlled in a confined space, avoiding the Fort Meyer trees and making tight turns close to the ground. The flight was a great success. The equivalent flight the previous year had only lasted 6 minutes. This time, the flyer remained in the air for 1 hour, 12 minutes, and 40 seconds. In the process, it covered a distance of about 40 miles and set a world record for time in the air with a passenger. On July 30th, Orville Wright took off for the flyer's final test before sealing the Army contract. It was a timed speed flight from Fort Meyer to Alexandria and return, a distance of 10 miles. He reassured his passenger Benjamin Falloy by saying,
"If I have any trouble, I'll land in a tree, or the thickest clump of trees I can find."
Falloy wrote an account of the flight.
All 25 horses in the engine were functioning perfectly as we skimmed over the treetops toward the balloon. The air was bumpy, and I had the feeling that Orville didn't have full control of the machine as we dipped groundward. It was as if someone on the ground had a string attached to us and would pull it occasionally as they would a kite. But each time, Orville would raise the elevator slightly, and we would gain back lost altitude.
A balloon marked a turning point at Shooter's Hill in Alexandria, where the George Washington Masonic Memorial now stands.
Orville came in low and rounded the turning point in a steep banking left turn, just missing a small group of trees. A fine demonstration of his piloting skill, but as I told him later, a bit too close to the treetops to suit me.
They arrived back at Fort Meyer, having passed all the tests. The Army contract was secure. Glenn Curtiss, the Wright brothers' great American rival, sold his first aircraft, the Golden Flyer, in June. In August, the Wrights filed a lawsuit against him for patent infringement. But Glenn Curtiss was in France to compete in a historic race meeting. The meeting was called the Grand Week of Aviation and was held in Reims, in the heart of the Champagne country, organized by the great Champagne producers. The Wright brothers didn't attend, but there were 3 of their French-built planes in the competition. The Grand Week generated great excitement. It was attended by a vast crowd that included royalty, celebrities, and a healthy selection of the super-rich of Europe and America. Curtiss was competing against the cream of French aviators, including Blériot, Latham, Farman, and Voisin. The meeting was to take 8 days and feature 6 major events. Aviation was still very young. Curtiss described some of his problems coming to terms with the conditions.
I began to pitch violently. This was caused by the heat waves rising and falling as the cooler air rushed in. The up and down motion was not at all pleasant, and I confess that I eased off the throttle several times on the first circuit. I had not then become accustomed to the feeling an aviator gets when the machine takes a sudden drop.
Early in the meeting, the Wright airplanes performed well, but the favorite for the speed prize was Louis Blériot. All week, Blériot and Curtiss improved on each other's times.
He started off with what seemed to be a terrific burst of speed. It looked to me as if he must be going twice as fast as my machine had flown. Latham and his Antoinette may be able to make better speed than they had thus far shown. I confess that I felt a good deal like a prisoner awaiting the decision of a jury.
It was a spectacularly successful event. It demonstrated conclusively that aviation in Europe had made great strides since 1908. The performances of Glenn Curtiss surprised everybody. Each day, records established by the Wright brothers toppled. But there was a price.
There were many smashed during the big meet on the plains of Bethany. At one time while flying, I saw as many as 12 machines strewn around the field, some wrecked and some disabled and being slowly hauled back to the hangars by hand or by horses.
In the course of the Grand Week, new marks for altitude, speed, and endurance were established. And Glenn Curtiss, with an average speed around the Rams course of more than 47 miles an hour, became the fastest man in the air. The Wright brothers' lead in aviation had disappeared. The little airport at College Park, just outside Washington, D.C., is the oldest continuously used airport in the world. In early October 1909, after the Army had bought the military flyer for the Signal Corps, Wilbur Wright came here to fulfill the last condition of the Army contract. He had to teach a group of Army officers to fly. Frank Lahm was one of 3 Signal Corps lieutenants nominated for pilot training. He had been on a balloon flight when he saw what was then a large pasture that would serve very well as a location for a hangar and a flight training center. His fellow first student was Frederick Humphreys, and later in the month they were joined by Benjamin Falloy, who had been Orville's passenger on the flight from Fort Meyer to Alexandria and back. Lahm and Humphreys were ready to solo by the end of the month. But Falloy, handicapped by his late arrival, only had 3 lessons before he was ordered to transport the military flyer, at that time the Army's only airplane, to Texas. There he taught himself to fly, writing to Orville when he needed help. Lahm, Humphreys, and Falloy were the first of a distinguished stream of Army pilots who learned to fly in Wright airplanes. Hap Arnold began his pilot training in Dayton. He found the system of controls on the Wright airplanes cumbersome and difficult to manage. As well as learning to fly, he had to master construction and maintenance before he qualified as a fully fledged military aviator. His certificate is dated July 1912. The first Wright Model B was built in 1910 and was a considerable change from the Wright Flyers. It had a rear elevator instead of the front-mounted surface of the early Wright aircraft. In Dayton, Ohio, there is a flying replica of a late Wright Model B. It was built and is flown by a group of Dayton enthusiasts.
We selected the B model because it was a little safer than the other 2, plus it was the world's first military production airplane, so it had historical significance, and so that's why we selected this model to build and fly. We made it heavier. Where they have on the cables, you'll notice here, we've got every cable in the same place they had it, but they had piano wire. And we have cable, and we've gone to a lot of metal where they had wood, and so in view of that, being heavier and stronger, we also had to get a bigger engine in it. So we are about twice as heavy, and we got over twice as much horsepower. The original Wright airplane had a warp wings to control it. And of course, it had a rudder to control the direction, but to turn and all, they warped the wings. The pressure on that was so high that, and they finally just came up with the idea that they would just put a slice in there and just make a flap. So that's where the ailerons came up, and so this wheel here controls the aileron motion. And then the rudder pedals here control the rudders for the direction here.
The B-Flyer replica operates out of Dayton General Airport. In the years since it's been flying, demand for appearances at air shows and special events has increased. But it's not easy to transport, and being slow and having short range, it can only fly to places that are reasonably close. The group that flies and maintains the airplane is largely voluntary and depends on public support to continue operating. This is by no means an exact replica of the flimsy airplanes that military pilots trained in and flew in the years before World War I. But even though it's heavier and stronger than the original, its performance in the air is comparable, and it gives a vivid impression of what a Wright airplane would have looked like in the skies above Dayton around 1912. Instrumentation and controls comply with modern safety standards, but sitting out in the open with just two wings, a tail, and no fuselage is definitely an experience in the tradition of aviation's pioneers.
The airplane still flies about like theirs. It cruises about 55, and that's with full power all the time. And you stall about 45. One way I can describe it is kind of like a old worn-out tractor going across a plowed field. The controls are very sloppy. You don't get the quick response that you do in a modern airplane. And the airplane, of course, is flying awful slow. The wing drops, and you turn the wheel to pick it up, and you just have to sit there and wait a while. And with so much wing surface that we have, the updrafts and downdrafts, you're just going all over the sky. So it's a real workout. Half hour, 45 minutes, man, you can ready to come down and rest. When we have to be real careful, if we get into very much of a headwind, we have to make sure that we're going to get back to the airport without running out of gas, because 20-mile-an-hour headwind and 55 miles an hour, you're down to about 30, 35 miles an hour. So the winds do have a lot of effect on it.
In spite of the Wright brothers' success in selling the Army its first airplane, by 1911 it was clear that the peak of their achievement in aviation was behind them. Their energy had been consumed by legal efforts to protect their patents. And in the meantime, the lead in aircraft manufacture had passed to Europe, where strong government support had helped aviation advance at a rapid rate. In May 1912, Wilbur died. Orville took over the management of the company. In 1915, he sold it, but he remained active in the aircraft industry all his life. This is the beach at Coney Island, New York, located at the southern end of the borough of Brooklyn. Coney Island is famous for its amusement park and the Coney Island Boardwalk. On Sunday, September 17, 1911, at the Sheepshead Bay Racetrack, just a short distance from here, an airplane that was a close relative of the Wright B-Flyer prepared to make one of aviation's most epic flights. The airplane was a Wright EX, a small, higher-powered version of the B model. The challenge to this airplane was to fly across America and win the $50,000 prize offered by William Randolph Hearst. Piloting the flimsy Wright biplane on this great adventure would be Calbreth Perry Rogers. Rogers, who had learned to fly at the Wright Brothers School in Dayton, came to prominence just a month before, walking away with over $11,000 of prize money from a big flying meet in Chicago. An attempt to fly across America needed backing, and Rogers got it from the Armor Company, naming his Wright airplane after their grape soft drink, Vin Fizz. They supplied a special train with accommodation and a workshop. Cal had to pay for fuel, repairs, and spare parts.
He was a man, unlike a good many pilots of the era, who came from really a very good family. His family, the Calbras and the Rogers and so on and so forth, were old names in American history. And I think Cal Rogers was one of those men who just had fallen in love with this idea of flying. And here was a way in which he could move himself forward in the field. One of the things you have to realize about the airplane business in those years, between 1910 and the beginning of World War I, is that it was real hard to make a living doing anything with airplanes. You almost had to become involved in flying as a spectator sport almost. And he saw that. He'd done a little bit of exhibition flying and then came up with the notion of the cross-country flight and went for it.
Cal Rogers wasn't the only person making the attempt. By the time Cal took off on September 17th, a former jockey, Jimmy Ward, was 4 days in front of him. As the Vin Fizz headed west, Robert G. Fowler, another graduate of the Wright Flying School, headed east, having started from San Francisco 6 days before. The plan of all three competitors was to navigate by following railroad tracks wherever possible. The first part of Cal's flight, 84 miles to Middletown, New York, went well. Cal's wife Mabel, his cousin John, and the Wright brothers' mechanic Charlie Taylor followed in the buffet Pullman car of the support train as Cal enjoyed the flight.
I never had the least trouble. My engine working as fine as one ever did. And the only thing I had to contend with was air currents over the Ramapo Mountains. 2,000 feet was the highest altitude that I attained, and this was in passing over these mountains, when I had to ascend to this height in order to select a landing space, in case anything happened. No man ever had a truer machine and a more perfect engine than I did today. There was not a miss of the cylinders, and not a swerve of the machine. It's Chicago in 4 days, if everything goes right.
But unfortunately, everything did not go right. Taking off from Middletown, Cal had an encounter with a tree.
I got the air all right, and thought I was clear of the willow tree. There was a sharp tilt, but I righted myself, and then I went at the big hickory just ahead. I rose to it and was clear of it when my eyes caught the wires just ahead of me, and I knew I would never clear those. I shut my power off. I felt the plane hit, and then she tilted forward.
Cal wasn't the only one having problems. Fowler had completely wrecked his plane and lost 12 days while it was rebuilt. Ward was delayed by weather and engine trouble. Cal was stuck in Middletown while Charlie Taylor worked for 40 hours to repair the Vin Fizz. It was ready to go again on September 21st, and Cal took off for a 95-mile flight to Hancock. Cal was not daunted by the accident or the delay. He was a man who was determined to enjoy the moment, and enjoy it he did.
I was above the currents, going faster than the wind, and the engine went on singing a sweet song. I lit a fresh cigar and let her go. An airman cannot tell much about the country he goes over. There are no signs up where he is, and little towns come so fast that a new one seems to begin before an old one ends. All I could see was a ribbon of silver below me, coiling around heavily wooded mountains.
There was a catch with the Hearst prize of $50,000 for the first pilot to fly across the continent. When the prize was announced on October 10, 1910, it was given a time limit of a year. From October 10, 1911, the $50,000 would no longer be available. It was now September 21st. Cal had 19 days to complete the flight if he was going to collect the prize. Under Cal's arrangement with the armor company, his sponsors, he would receive $5 for every mile he flew while east of the Mississippi. Once he moved west of the Mississippi, the figure would drop to $4 a mile. The armor company had reasoned that the population west of the Mississippi wasn't so dense, and there were fewer people to be influenced by the advertising the flight offered. Cal quickly discovered that accidents weren't the only potential hazard to the well-being of his airplane. When he lost his way at a rail junction, he landed to get his bearings. Pretty soon a crowd gathered and told Cal he was 45 miles away from where he ought to be. He wasn't impressed by their behavior toward the Vin Fizz.
They didn't mind climbing up to get a good spot. They liked to work the levers, sit upon the seat, warp the planes, and finger the engine. I nearly lost my temper when a man came up with a chisel to punch his name on an upright.
And in the air, there was a stream of hazards to be overcome.
A procession of air pockets, eddies, swirls, and cross currents. One place seems suddenly to drop from under you. Then at another, you begin to teeter and twist, and your hand on the warping lever does a snake dance. Flying is hard work on a day like this.
Cal dealt with a string of minor mishaps. Then on October 2nd, he had his third major accident trying to take off from Huntington, Indiana. It was pretty clear he was not going to get to Los Angeles in time to collect the prize. But that thought didn't deter Cal.
I am bound for Los Angeles and the Pacific Ocean. Prize or no prize, that's where I am bound. And if canvas, steel, and wire, together with a little brawn, tendon, and brain, stick with me, I mean to get there. The $50,000 prize seems out of the question. But anyway, it won't matter much. I'm going to do this, whether I get $5 or 50 cents or nothing. I'm going to cross this continent simply to be the first to cross in an airplane.
Charlie Taylor, the man who built the engine for the Wright brothers' first powered flight, was an invaluable help as the trip went on. Time after time, Cal ran into problems which Charlie had to fix. The strain of the flight told on Cal. By the time he reached Texas, he'd lost 15 pounds. His rival Ward had long ago dropped out, but Fowler was still in the race. At Tucson, Arizona, Cal met up with him, still heading east in spite of problems every bit as daunting as those encountered by Cal. By now, Cal had become philosophical about the never-ending accidents.
These wrecks are part of the game, and to be expected, but, of course, are unwelcome.
There were no airfields, and sites for takeoff and landing were less than ideal. Here, the Vin Fizz is trailing a clump of hay, a souvenir of a takeoff from a convenient pasture. After 49 days, 4,231 railroad miles, 3 days, 10 hours, and 4 minutes of actual flying time, and yet more mishaps, Rogers and the heavily rebuilt Vin Fizz arrived in Pasadena, California. It had been an amazing feat of endurance.
What you have with Cal is that incredible determination. He kept going, through broken bones and broken airplanes and storm and flood and trees in the way, you name it. He just picked himself up, dusted himself off, and went on to the next step. I think that's what's extraordinary about the guy.
Cal broke his ankle in a crash on the way from Pasadena to Long Beach. After recovering, but still on crutches, he finally reached Long Beach on December 10, 1911, and dipped the wheels of the Vin Fizz into the Pacific.
My record will not last long. With proper landing places along the route and other conditions looked after, the trip can easily be made in 30 days or less.
2 months later, Cal Rogers was making a flight just off Long Beach. His plane was hit by a flock of seagulls and crashed. Cal died close by the spot where he'd ended his epic transcontinental journey.
Cal Rogers didn't cut our time to the coast, as they say, by much, after all. And yet the fact that someone had done it, the fact that, you know, this determined guy had kept going and had actually made it from coast to coast, and the fact that others coming the other way did it in a little easier fashion pretty quickly thereafter, I think did impress people with the fact that the airplane had arrived. It was still in its infancy, and there were still a great many things that it wasn't capable of doing. But I think it was the kind of feat that said to people, you know, it's here to stay, and it is developing, and one of these days, it is going to have an enormous impact.